All right. Welcome back, everyone. Ending a day of engaging discussions and really incredible panel sessions. I am honored to welcome you all to the closing session of the first day of the Unite Global Summit. Key takeaways from today's session demonstrate that we must work together in strengthening our response to current and future global health threats, ensuring that all stakeholders from the government, community, and multinational organizations must come together in the fight to end the global burden of infectious diseases. This closing session will focus on delivering a holistic perspective to the answer to global health threats. We must ensure a cohesive response to the continuum of care, including better prevention and better diagnostics to ensure higher quality vaccines. This allows us to better measure and assess where we can invest our resources and what exactly we need from policymakers. Interoperability is key to ensuring better public health responses. For this discussion, I am delighted to introduce Dakota Gruner, the Executive Director of ID22 Alliance. Dakota launched the ID22 Alliance following her work at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, where she served as an aide-de-camp to the CEO. As ID22's Executive Director, Dakota leads overall strategy, builds critical partnerships with public and private sector stakeholders, and continuously focuses the organization on an ethics-first approach. Dakota, thank you so much for joining us. I now give the stage to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining today's discussion, and thank you to our esteemed hosts and speakers. I'm Dakota Gruner, the Executive Director of ID 2020, and it's an honor to be moderating today's discussions with a truly remarkable group of panelists. Given the prominence of our panelists today, I hesitate to say that my background is in global health. However, as you just heard, prior to joining ID 2020 in 2016, I worked at Gavi as an aide-de-camp to the CEO and as a management consultant working on vaccine supply security. So I get particularly excited when asked to speak about the continuum of care in global health, something with direct relevance for my current day-to-day job at ID 2020, and about the need for cross-sector collaboration, which has been a theme throughout my career. In just 6 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended our world. And for those of us in global health, it has brought renewed focus and urgency to our work while posing significant operational and resourcing challenges. Individuals and organizations are being forced to reckon with the risk of coming into a medical clinic for routine care, routine immunizations, and outreach campaigns are nearly impossible. As we collectively race to develop and manufacture vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutic scale, we are straining our development and regulatory timelines. Funding is being diverted to address the immediate needs of the pandemic, and the list goes on. And I think core to each one of these is that the pandemic has asked all of us how we can collaborate more effectively to drive improvements in global health outcomes and how we can provide better continuity of care for individuals. Before turning it over to our esteemed panelists, I wanted to share one such example from my own work. ID 2020 was launched in 2016 to foster collaboration between governments, the private sector, and civil society towards a common vision: good digital ID for all. Digital identity has the power to transform lives. It can enable individuals to exercise their rights, enjoy a full protection under the law, enhance access to critical social services, and enable all of us to participate fully as citizens and voters and transact in an increasingly digital economy. But today, 1 in 7 people on Earth, fully 1.1 billion people, are unable to prove their identity through any recognized means. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, suddenly we are all thinking about how one proves important attributes about themselves, how somebody can prove that they've had a recent negative test result, how they can prove that they've received a COVID vaccine when a vaccine comes online, and how we can do so in a way that affords individuals privacy and protection for their rights. And so good digital identity, digital credentials that are portable, user-managed, and privacy protecting could allow just that. Individuals could access care wherever, then carry their health records with them to another clinic, selectively and very granularly sharing their information with their new care provider so they get the care they need in a new setting. This is just one example of how we're beginning to break down and work around silos and to ensure quality care across the continuum of care. And if done carefully with the necessary legal protections and privacy protecting technical architecture, the pandemic could actually accelerate investments in this vital digital infrastructure. And so what we're seeing, and what I'd posit from the example that I just shared, is that COVID-19 has had wide-ranging and sometimes unexpected implications across the continuity of care and for how we collaborate as organizations. And so with that, I am delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel of experts to discuss how their work is being impacted by the global COVID pandemic, how it is changing how they collaborate with their partners, and how they are contributing to the COVID response. So first, 𝗕𝗵𝗁, the chair of the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. Hind, excited to turn it over to you.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak at this important event and to this outstanding group of high-level people. I have listened to today's interventions with great interest and was pleased to be reminded of the progress that has been achieved and what can still be achieved in the face of infectious diseases, thanks to strong political will and great leadership. Obviously, infectious diseases and pandemics, unfortunately, as you all know, are a regular occurrence. And COVID is not the first. We were hit with H1N1 in 2009, by Ebola in 2014, by Zika in 2016, and obviously COVID now. And we're still facing the problems from diarrhea, as diarrhea still remains to be one of the leading causes of death in children in developing countries, and a major contributor to work absenteeism and loss of productivity. And of course, there is COVID-19, the effects of which we are still currently experiencing. In each instance of these epidemics, sanitation and hygiene, or the lack of it, played a key role. And despite all our collective efforts over the many decades, still globally, more than 1 in every 2 people do not have access to safely managed sanitation services. Nearly 10% of the world's population still resorts to open defecation, and more than 1 in 3 people do not have basic hand washing facilities in their own homes. 1 in 3 schools and 1 in 5 healthcare facilities do not have sanitation and hygiene services, with 70% of healthcare workers not routinely practicing hand washing with soap. On any given day, hundreds of millions of women and girls menstruate, yet they do not have the means to manage their menstruation health safely. At the current trajectory, it will take beyond 2070 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of universal access to safely managed sanitation, making this one the most left behind of the SDGs. The lack of success in addressing sanitation and hygiene-related SDGs so far severely affects other SDGs. Many of the most serious diseases and leading causes of child mortality are directly related to poor sanitation and hygiene. Sanitation and hygiene are the first line of defense against pandemics such as COVID. Lack of basic sanitation and hygiene in healthcare facilities leads to poor quality care, compromises patient safety, and exacerbates the spread of antimicrobial resistance, and undermines efforts to improve child and maternal health. Lack of sanitation and hygiene, particularly during menstruation, negatively impact women and girls. Their safety from sanitation-related gender-based violence, their mobility, freedom of choice, health, including sexual and reproductive health, and their access to education, employment, and social and economic power. Poor sanitation and hygiene in schools impacts children's health, the quality of the learning environment, and can pose challenges in school attendance, particularly for those menstruating. Lack of sanitation and hygiene costs the world billions each year. For all these reasons, we need to catalyze change and accelerate collective and sustained commitment. WSCC, which many of you will know, will therefore evolve into a new organization, the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. The Sanitation and Hygiene Fund is inspired by best practices of successful global financing mechanisms, such as Gavi and the Global Fund. It will focus its support where it's most needed, countries with the highest sanitation and hygiene burden, and that are least able to respond, primarily in Africa and Asia. It will support these countries through catalytic funding to achieve their national sanitation and hygiene targets at household level, at schools, healthcare centers, and will improve menstrual health and boost the role of innovation and support urgent scale-up of investments in the national COVID-19 preparedness, and thereby help building long-term resilience against future waves of infectious and similar threats. The fund will officially be launched by UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed later this year. As you know, the world has been struggling with shortcomings of sanitation and hygiene facilities amongst its most vulnerable population for many decades. With 10 years to 2030, we cannot give up on the SDG target, but instead must translate the rhetoric into action. You all, in your role as powerful parliamentarians or partners, witness the shortcomings of sanitation and hygiene in your own constituencies or work environment. If we want to make a real difference in the lives of billions of people, if we want to ensure their dignity, human rights, and livelihoods, and provide them with an effective means against infectious diseases and pandemics, we have to step up now and ensure they have access to sanitation and hygiene. You as parliamentarians have an incredibly important role to play. Sanitation and hygiene need strong voices like yours that can credibly speak up for their constituencies, that can rally support and ensure collective action is now taken that will improve the lives of billions of people. I thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to work with you as we launch the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your comments. Next, I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Dr. Catharina Bohm, the Chief Executive Officer of FIND, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics. Katrina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers very much for the invitation and for bringing this important topic to a virtual forum today. I have one of the colleagues sharing slides for me. Could you please do that? Could I please ask the Unite team to share slides? Dakota, do you know if, there they are. Perfect, excellent. So I would like to talk to you today about our experience with COVID-19 and, how to use the learnings from COVID-19 to build back better and how to grasp opportunities that we see for infectious and non-communicable diseases based on this crisis situation. Thank you. Before COVID-19 hit us, we had completed a strategic review looking at where are we with testing and the diagnostic situation in the world. And what we saw basically was a systematic lack of investment in testing that jeopardizes both universal health coverage and global health security, really sort of two sides of the same coin. And what we saw was that for the majority of countries we work in, only 1% of primary healthcare clinics had even the most basic diagnostic infrastructure. And only 14% of hospitals had tests, available for a basic set of 8 diseases. And wherever we look, whether it's for infectious diseases, hepatitis C, or non-communicable diseases, for example, diabetes, we see that 1 in 2 patients go undiagnosed. And, I think this was mentioned today to you by a lot of my colleagues that spoke about specific diseases earlier. So how can we expect early detection of disease outbreaks if basically the testing infrastructure is not available on the ground? Next slide. COVID has shown a spotlight on the importance of testing, and really, we saw with COVID, I think, much more clearly how testing underpins the entire pandemic response, from detecting the first infections to implementation of a test, trace, and isolate strategy, to hopefully going forward a test and treat mode once we have treatment candidates, to a targeted vaccine deployment, and finally testing plays an important role in the surveillance and confirming, hopefully at some point soon, that the pandemic will have been defeated. We've seen clearly how testing strategies have saved lives and, you know, rely on the testing infrastructure on the ground daily to inform policy decisions. Next slide. But we've also seen, you know, through this crisis, the glaring gaps that really inhibited access to tests. First of all, on the R&D front, where, you know, it was very clear that a lot of investment went into research and development of tests, but very soon we had more and more tests coming out with a complete lack of clarity on how to use them, what to use them, what type of tests were being needed, etc. For example, you know, now we have in our global COVID test pipeline more than 1,200 tests registered. On the manufacturing side, we very quickly, as you know, entered a supply chain war, where we really realized, you know, that we had become victims as a global community of a, you know, supply chain that relied on 1 to 2 players globally for everything, including raw materials. You know, on the regulatory front, where we saw that, you know, very quickly we entered a Wild West situation with a lot of substandard tests being used by a lot of countries and, you know, millions of tests having to be thrown into the dustbin because they didn't work. In terms of access to tests, we saw that low middle income countries very often lost the battle in terms of access to tests. Reservations were made, domestic markets secured the tests. And so we very much struggled with the market situation and enabling access to much needed tests for low middle income countries. And last not least, of course, the weak infrastructure in parts on the ground really slowed uptake of testing, specifically in low resource settings. Next slide. I think you've heard a lot over the course of the day about, you know, how, you know, core disease programs and health services are being disrupted, and how the gains we've made over the last years are being lost as we speak for TB, HIV, and malaria, for example. Here shown at the example of, you know, the Global Fund model and estimates in terms of lives lost for each of these core diseases. And so the question very much forward is, you know, how can we bring this back on course and make sure that we're not putting the SDGs at risk? Next slide. You know, we have learned with our COVID-19 program a lot of positive lessons. And so from our perspective, you know, our involvement in COVID-19 is through our co-convening of the ACT Accelerator partnership, Access to COVID-19 Tools partnership. And so what we see there is, for the first time, we see a true cohesive end-to-end response from R&D all the way to access across commodities. And so this partnership approach, this new partnership approach, and we're co-convening the diagnostic pillar of the partnership with the Global Fund, has basically shown to us how one can make progress very rapidly. And so we'd like to, going forward, basically apply a similar model to other diseases and to other, you know, ecosystem challenges. But basically, it has enabled us to very quickly get tests out to people on the ground, to very quickly train the first laboratories, you know, with very strong leadership from Africa, you know, as of early February. You know, we are now at a stage where, as a partnership, we have evaluated a large number of rapid diagnostic tests and have found 2 that are working well and that we will roll out, as we speak. And so basically driving access to quality rapid diagnostic tests has been a core mandate, and the integration with vaccine development, with treatment development has been, from our perspective, quite unique. Next slide. So when we look at the COVID-19 response, we see that already, there are elements that are leaving a legacy. For example, we see very new mechanisms that have been created that can enable equitable access and could also be used for other diseases, such as the global allocation mechanism that we are applying, for diagnostics, but many of you have also seen that from a vaccine perspective, for example. Much better demand forecasting from countries, closing the demand-supply loop, innovative licensing agreements that now ensure sufficient supply. On the R&D side, really a different world in terms of data sharing, IP sharing. We've had a lot of governments share their evaluation data, for example, to inform product selection by countries. We see for the first time in the diagnostic world, tech transfers to low middle income countries, manufacturing ramp up to ensure regional production in low middle income countries, etc. And so that, hopefully will make rapid implementation possible, but also will hopefully enable, a strengthened disease surveillance infrastructure across the board, as well as, will enable us to work on local production, local innovation, also much more broadly. Next slide. I think COVID-19 itself provides a solid investment case for global health security. Many of us have now been saying for a number of years, or at least since Ebola 2014, that we need continuous investment to enable pandemic preparedness rather than panic response in very high amounts. And so I think we hope that these frightening numbers in terms of spend make it clear that we need a more continuous investment in infrastructure, in early outbreak detection and response mechanisms to avoid this situation going forward. Next slide. And from our perspective, it's really about future-proofing the diagnostic ecosystem through partnership, but also across systems, building on the learnings from COVID. And so that needs investment in technical solutions, so technical solutions in terms of better tests, real-time sentinel surveillance systems, investment in response speed with the support to global regional networks, for example, and infrastructure that allows for data sharing, sample access, etc. But also investment in market sustainability on the supply side, procurement side, building and pre-building allocation mechanisms, for diagnostics and across commodities. So from our perspective, this investment in diagnostic systems really underpins universal health coverage, and we've really seen how the gap has led to putting health security at risk. And so we think it's an important element of the coin that can provide us with many learnings across the board. So with that, I'd like to close. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Folu Olubosi, the Senior Director of Clinical Development at the TB Alliance. Folu, the stage is yours.
Dakota. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So thanks again, Dakota. It's a pleasure for me to join today's session, and a huge thanks to the meeting organizers, that's Unite, and also to all the panelists. My name is 𝗕𝗶𝗿𝗀𝘀. I'm Senior Director of Clinical Development, and I head up the South African office of the TB Alliance. The TB Alliance is a not-for-profit product development partnership dedicated to developing new, faster-acting, and affordable tuberculosis cure. I am speaking here today because tuberculosis, also known as TB, is the leading infectious disease killer and the leading cause of death among drug-resistant infections. In 2018, 10 million people globally fell ill from active TB, and 1.5 million people died from this infection. It is the single largest cause of death amongst any drug-resistant infection, representing close to 1 in 3 deaths from antimicrobial resistance. So tuberculosis is a huge problem, and it needs a collaborative and global approach to diagnose, treat, and ultimately defeat it, and other epidemics, including AIDS, malaria, and COVID-19. Now, much of today's conversation has been centered around the global response to COVID-19. Apart from the significant impact on every facet of our lives, COVID-19 is actually worsening the devastation of ongoing epidemics, again, including AIDS, TB, malaria. And it also threatens to derail hard-won progress against these epidemics. How has COVID-19 done this, for example, in TB? So 1, patients who have or have had TB are more susceptible to COVID-19 infections, leading to a higher morbidity and mortality in the disease population. 2, diversion of human and financial resources from TB care and research to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, interruption of TB care and significantly reduced diagnosis of new cases due to the preventive lockdown measures. By disrupting the testing and treatment of TB and HIV, it is estimated that the COVID-19 pandemic could result in an additional 6.3 million tuberculosis cases and 1.4 million additional TB deaths worldwide over the next 5 years. I really pray that this doesn't happen, as this really will be a disaster. We need innovative solutions, and one model that may offer insights is that of the Product Development Partnership. What is a Product Development Partnership, or popularly known as the PDP? It is a 21st century non-profit organizational structure that enables the public, private, academic, and philanthropic sectors to aggregate funding for the development of drugs, vaccines, and other public health tools. PDPs like TB Alliance have delivered game-changing innovations with sustained and substantial support from donors, including European governments like Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. PDPs are well positioned to contribute to the fight against COVID-19. We have seen major contributions from PDPs such as FIND, 𝗖𝗍𝗄, and the DNDi, amongst others. The TB Alliance has developed the single largest portfolio of new TB drugs, with over 30 projects currently under active development. We do believe that some of these compounds also have the potential to be effective in the treatment of COVID-19, and we are currently evaluating these compounds in partnership with the Harvard University. The PDP model is one that has shown concrete returns on donor investment and is a proven pathway towards game-changing global health innovations, especially in diseases for which little or no profit motive exists. The organization pioneered the concept of regimen drug development. And what I mean by that is that instead of developing just one drug with the objective of adding it to available treatment standard of care, the objective of this regimen drug development is to identify and develop about 3 new drugs simultaneously to form a regimen from the get-go. And with this regimen combination, this regimen combination is tested through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. If the trials confirm the safety and efficacy of the regimen is approved for the disease treatment. The 3 drugs or so are novel drugs with unique and different mechanisms of action, killing the microorganism, and used together creates what I would call a triple whammy to effectively kill the bug. Of note is that this process also drastically reduces the drug development and approval timelines, because traditionally developing such a 3-drug regimen, for example, would mean running clinical trials on each drug component first, and then afterwards developing or running the trials as a final regimen combination. But by treating the regimen as a single therapeutic unit from the get-go, the time to getting this regimen approved and available to the patients who need them is cut down by about 2/3. An accelerated development timeline by developing drug combinations is one potential lesson that could be leveraged in the development of new treatments for COVID-19. The development and rapid introduction of the 𝗕𝗶𝗁 regimen is an example of global collaboration in the fight against pandemics and can serve as a model as the world grapples with the antimicrobial resistance and COVID-19. When I talk about 𝗕𝗶𝗁 regimen, the B stands for bedaquiline from Janssen, and the P is pretomanin from the TB Alliance, and L is linezolid from Pfizer and other generics. These 3 drugs have different unique mechanisms of actions against the TB bacteria, making the regimen very effective. Efficacy data shows that it has successfully treated 9 out of 10 patients with very highly resistant tuberculosis in its pivotal trial. The regimen was first approved in the United States last year, and we have received EMA and India approval this year. The impact of this new regimen is that instead of patients using the current standard of care, which basically involves taking truckload of pills, in some cases daily intramuscular injections for up to 18 and sometimes 24 months, now we have an all-oral 3-drug regimen for just 6 months. So at this stage, I would like to offer a few closing thoughts for the panel. We have seen in the past 6 months what true political will can do. We must ensure that we can leverage this encouraging development to secure long-term and lasting gains in public health. The progress against TB has been hard-won, but is still nowhere near enough to end this epidemic, as envisioned by the Sustainable Development Goals. Despite the justified massive influx of spending on COVID-19, multi-billion-dollar yearly funding gaps remain for both TB treatment and research. So at this stage, I would please allow me to conclude with a question for those watching today, which is what lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic response that can be applied to the epidemics that were here before and are all but certain to linger long after this pandemic is brought under control. So thank you for your time.
Paulo, thank you so much. To share some remarks, next we have Alan Donnelly from the G20 Health Initiative. Alan, the floor is yours. Alan, I think you're still on mute, if you can.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, really, I'm joining this panel of real experts in the field of global health. As a former parliamentarian, and the reason why I was keen to join this is because of the link that we've had with Unite for 2 or 3 years now. And I'm here as a former member of the European Parliament, but I chair the G20 Health and Development
Alan, if I can pause you quickly, at least for me, I can't hear your audio at the moment. Alan, I apologize. I hate to interrupt, but I can't hear you, and I don't know if our other panelists can. Alan, with my apologies, I hate to interrupt. I don't think any of us can hear you, and perhaps you could drop off the call quickly and then join back in. In the interim, I think while Alan is dropping off and joining back into the call, I know that Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, was planning on joining us today and unfortunately was called away on urgent business. He has instead shared some video remarks, and if I could ask the Unite team, we're going to show a portion of his video remarks. We don't unfortunately have time to watch the entire thing, but I know that he was very eager to join us today, and his contribution will be a significant addition to this discussion. Can the Unite team stream Dr. Kim's video? Thank you to the Unite team. I know that this is a complex technical task. Appreciate it.
On the open day. I'll now be going into presentation mode with the slides. This presentation is about COVID-19 vaccine development, and in particular, the issues beyond the development of the vaccine itself. I think everyone here now, after hearing it for about 9 months, realizes that under normal circumstances, it take 5 to 10 years to make a vaccine. But these are not normal circumstances. as I think everyone recognizes. Vaccine companies quote a cost of between $500 million and $1.5 billion to develop the vaccine, and a failure rate to market authorization from the lab, so from lab to license, of 93%. So that only 1 in 10 vaccines make it all the way from discovery and exploratory stage on the far left to the to being sold on the open market. Phase 1, I think everyone realizes, is about safety. Phase 2 about immunogenicity and safety, and phase 3 about efficacy and safety. And I think we have to recall, and we actually have to emphasize, that it is very important for vaccines which are given to people who are otherwise healthy, for these vaccines to be shown to be safe and efficacious. But we would take this normal 5 to 10 year time frame and compress it into 6 to 18 months. And I think many people have talked about the difficulties of doing that. And this is just an example of how you might convert something that would normally take 5 years into something that might take 1 year. Under normal circumstances, you'd start in preclinical work. You'd start in the laboratory, you'd make a vaccine, you test it in animals, then you test it in phase 1. By the end of year 1, you might be ready to do an analysis of safety and maybe a little bit of immunogenicity. You might actually go back and reformulate or come up with a different dosing regimen or a different schedule. And then you move on to phase 2. After another year or so, vaccine induced the correct immune responses in the target population. If you're satisfied with that, then you move into phase 3. And phase 3 normally takes a year to a year and a half. There's a period of enrollment. And at the end of the day, you analyze safety and efficacy. And if it's safe and efficacious, then you might be able to submit the data for registration. But often, in some countries, 2 phase 3 trials are sometimes required in order to obtain a market authorization. Now, how would we then go from 5 years to a much more compressed schedule? What you see in the blue bar there is safety, which means that all along the pathway from year 1 to year 5, the company is able to evaluate whether the vaccine is safe. In the truncated form of this analysis, we continue to look at many of the same things. In phase 1, you look at safety, but you may actually be looking very carefully at immunogenicity, whether the vaccine is making neutralizing antibody, binding antibody, functional antibodies, or cytotoxic T cell response. All very important. You might actually combine phase 1 and phase 2. So many of the studies that we see now published are actually phase 1/phase 2 studies, where they're actually looking at safety, but also looking significantly at immunogenicity. Are the correct immune responses made? Before phase 2 is over, in fact, probably several months after the final dose is given, the second dose in the case of most of the COVID-19 vaccines, an analysis of immunogenicity and safety is done, and phase 3 starts. So we have seen vaccines that went from phase 1 to phase 3. In the phase 3 analyses can often start again after the final vaccination is done, which would be after month 1. But importantly, in a phase 3 study with thousands of volunteers, in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, 30 to 50,000 volunteers, will take some time to enroll these individuals. If the company is convinced then at the end of, after the accumulation of a certain number of endpoints, as is done in an endpoint-driven analysis, or after certain company will then look at do an interim analysis. With the current set of COVID-19 vaccines, people are anticipating that there will be safety and efficacy data, at least preliminarily available, by Q4 of 2020, so sometime between September and December. With an efficacy and safety signal, when the company and the National Regulatory Authority are convinced that a vaccine is safe and efficacious, and after review of the data, registration or emergency use authorization can be applied for. How it will work with COVID-19 vaccines, no one's quite certain, but I think there's been a lot of speculation recently about emergency use and potentially the ethics and science around emergency use, and whether a vaccine that has been rushed into safety and efficacy evaluation will be accepted by the people who need to be vaccinated. One of the very important things, though, is that we continue to collect safety data, which you can see in the blue bar below in the truncated design. The amount of safety information is significantly less than you would have over a long period of time with a more traditional analysis. Now, it's important to realize that most major safety events occur within the first 2 months. So we would actually have enough information for the major safety events. But would we have enough information, for instance, to know that there might be antibody-dependent enhancement, as was seen with the Sanofi dengue vaccine? And that information might not come until year 2 or year 3. So for that reason, although the shortened clinical trial period will give us enough data around efficacy, does the vaccine protect against infection and disease, what we may not have is enough data around long-term safety, so that even though emergency use or provisional approval is given to the vaccine, longer, more formal monitoring for safety should be necessary and should be performed. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide.
I think we either may have just lost the video stream or have cut it off. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to watch the entirety of Dr. Kim's remarks, but I know that the Unite team will make that available to everyone listening today so that you can hear the entirety of what he has said, because clearly it's incredibly important as we think through the global COVID response. With that, I'm very excited to use the remainder of our time to open this up to a brief discussion amongst our panelists. I think each has presented their perspective on how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the course of their day-to-day work and how it may set the stage for a better global health infrastructure moving forward. And one thing that I would love to turn to the panelists and discuss first is that clearly what we've seen in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic is that global health has become an international priority. As Folu mentioned, political will is at an all-time high. And so a question for each of you is, how can we ensure that public health doesn't disappear as an international priority after we end the struggle with COVID-19? And is this an opportunity to create a global strategy or to simply sort of raise public consciousness about the importance of global health? I'll open the floor. Whomever wants to speak first, please jump in.
Maybe I'll start then. So I think, the question is excellent, Dakota, and very timely, right? I mean, clearly the GDPs of all countries decrease with this crisis, right? And so I think many global health players are very worried with regard to the resources going forward, especially resources needed to fight diseases outside of COVID-19. But even within COVID-19, when you look, for example, at the ACTA partnership, we see significant funding gaps for the fight against COVID-19 in low-middle income countries, right? So, for example, the diagnostic pillar so far has only met 9% of its resource mobilization needs, to bring the necessary diagnostic to countries. But also, for example, the treatment pillar struggles very much. So, what can we do going forward? Indeed, I think it is to come up with a renewed investment case and show how things play together, right? Just listening alone to this panel, we see how diverse the asks are, and I think that may be confusing for policymakers. So I think it's important to bring that together into a renewed joint effort and a very clear investment case with clear messages, clear priorities.
Dakota, may I jump in now? I see it probably from a different perspective, and I see that it's time for actually all the agencies, whether they're funds or all the multilaterals working in health, to get together and start working in a way to support countries to build the proper systems. Till now, there has been so much investments in health, yet still in every country, whenever we're faced with epidemic, you'll see the fragility of the health system. You'll see its vulnerability, and it's not really institutionalized. We're not really supporting countries to really develop their surveillance systems to make sure that they have their plans for outbreak response. And at the same time, you know, I believe now it's time for us all to get together and work on strengthening health systems and look at it in a comprehensive way and look at the determinants to health. I spoke today about sanitation and hygiene as an important building block to really protect health. How do we look at it comprehensively? How do we link the dots? How do we ensure that we institutionalize so that we're not reactive with every epidemic, because COVID is not going to be the last one. At the same time, how do we encourage research and improve vaccine development and improve surveillance? So I see that really now I think we have to take a step back and look at all the agencies working in health and start working in different ways and start playing stronger synergies and start really building capacities at country level. So we have the systems are there to be able to respond to epidemics. So over.
Although I think you're muted.
Oh, I need to unmute. Okay, I thought maybe it was being controlled. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so thanks, Katarina. Time's time. So, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and probably one of the way I always think about it is to reflect on what has really happened during this pandemic. You know, quite personally, I've been really impressed by the global collaboration and things that I've seen, you know, to tackle this pandemic. And I can give you a few examples. I mean, so a simple basic one, I spoke to a South African doctor who also, one of our investigators who's also working on COVID-19. And she mentioned to me that there's actually a WhatsApp group among several doctors globally, I mean, all across the different continents, where they communicate and treatment strategies. They tell them what's working best here, what's not working well here. And people are learning from those mistakes, you know, in real time and applying it to their patients. And it's part of the reasons why, for example, in South Africa, I think we've seen that the mortality rate hasn't been as high as probably expected. So that was really very fascinating and impressive. We've seen if you're watching the news, we see all the effort from different pharmaceutical companies, research organizations, everybody coming together, you know, to develop new medicines, to develop new vaccines, you know, very impressive. A lot of also, apart from the development, there's also a lot of push to have some kind of expedited approval timelines, which we've seen before, like in the Ebola vaccine, some other pandemics, but I'm also happy to see that it's also happening here. Lastly, what I've also seen that was quite impressive was the massive global impouring of funding from different governments and philanthropy, different research organizations, you know, coming together, mainly to provide funding to different organizations to support with the development of medicines and vaccines. So I think this is something that we really need to build on and also improve on, and hopefully not make this, I think as Katarina mentioned, not make it reactive, but to be something that's always there to react as soon as we have any pandemic or any epidemic. If you look at tuberculosis, for example, if every country can donate or can dedicate 0.1% of what is known as the gross domestic expenditure on R&D on TB research, the funding gap goal will be fully met. And I think, again, this is the kind of things, the mindset that the people in power should be thinking about, again, to prevent a more, to be ready to react as soon as possible and not to be reactive when the problem is already here. So that's really my thoughts on the question.
Thank you. Thank you. So calls for collaboration across the global health sector are not new, and institutional silos, I think, continue to plague all of our work. And I'm curious, how has COVID changed the way that each of you and each of your organizations is working with its peers or with its partners. And what do you believe are the sort of most significant drivers of how we might make a meaningful change towards better institutional collaboration moving forward? And do you wanna start?
Yes, it's funny. I'm doing a piece of work with the Global Action Plan, which has the 12 agencies working with health and committed to working better together. And I think there has been some lessons in which the agencies have collaborated better, especially in keeping some of the services alive. I think we have to really capture those lessons learned, because while there are a couple of experiences where the agencies got together in support of the country, where there has been a collective response, there has been many incidences just because people were rushing to provide a service, rushing to support the countries, but that people forget coordination and synergy is important. I think it's a good lesson now that at least we start with the 12 agencies that have committed to work better together under the Global Action Plan towards achievement of 𝗬𝗎C, for them to take stock. We have already a good, I think, a booklet on lessons learned in Ebola and how they can benefit us. And we are learning as we're going with COVID, obviously. I mean, I think the investments made for the diagnostics, for the vaccines is excellent. But how do we really support the countries? How do we support the countries to be better prepared? I think we have to probably mobilize more efforts and think strategically of how the different agencies that are investing in health systems can work better together and institutionalize it. Right now, I think we are all in a rush to support and mitigate the impact of the pandemic, that we probably have to think about it a bit more strategically. Thanks.
And maybe also to mention, I mean, like I mentioned during my presentation, the TB Alliance, FIND, the IRV, these are product development partnerships. And like I mentioned again, it's already in a way set up, with the collaboration from public, private, philanthropic organizations, and they kind of already ready in a way, set up to be able to react quickly, share resources, especially in terms of research, and develop new vaccines and medicines in a timely manner. The TB Alliance joined the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition, and we, like I mentioned, we do have some compounds that we think could be effective in the treatment of COVID-19. But again, I think the product development partnership are already set up in a way to be able to react in a nimble manner to this kind of pandemic or epidemic situation.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I feel we've already talked quite a little bit about new partnership models applied for COVID-19. From FIND's perspective, our anchor partners in our COVID-19 response were the World Health Organization and the Global Fund. But we also work closer than ever with organizations such as Gavi, CEPI, and UNIDAID, for example, right? So it has brought a lot of international partners closer together, and we see the direct benefits from that. I think we've never ever been so fast in getting to policy guidelines, in getting diagnostics regulatory approved, in working with the Africa CDC and PAHO on making sure that that they are that there are training guidelines, implementation guidelines available, and that countries are informed about the tests. So I think we will see, when we digest this at some point, that a lot of partnerships have been created that hopefully will last beyond beyond COVID-19. And have brought a lot of pros in terms of speed, in terms of comprehensiveness of a response, and in terms of sustainability.
Thank you. I agree. I think that that's a, even just at a very interpersonal level, the degree to which we're all interacting and reaching out to, to our peer and partner organizations is something that will strengthen global health broadly moving forward. So I think we only have time for one final question, and perhaps to put each of you on the spot very quickly. I think each one of you have touched upon a number of critical areas where further investment is necessary to improve health outcomes and to prevent further pandemics. But we know we're working in a landscape with significant resourcing constraints. As Katerina said, with GDP falling across the world, we should expect that donor contributions will fall in kind. And so given that, and given the audience here, a group of parliamentarians with real influence over what we prioritize, what is the single investment that you would like to highlight for each of them as sort of the most important investment that they could make in building a more resilient global health infrastructure? Maybe Folo, do you want to start? Oh, please unmute yourself.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We could hear you. I think you muted yourself in the process.
How about now?
Perfect.
Hello, can you hear? Okay. All right, so as I was saying, like I mentioned in my presentation, tuberculosis is really a leading infectious disease killer. And I also tried to talk about the burden of disease in terms of what happened in 2018, 10 million people fell ill from active tuberculosis. And again, about 1.5 million people died from tuberculosis. So, I mean, if you ask me from my perspective, I would really say that due to the high disease burden, and challenges faced in terms of TB research, developing new medicines, I think really concentrating on investing in TB research will be what I will point out as an important thing for the audience on this call to really consider.
Thank you. Katerina.
I've worked on TB for much of my life, right? So I'm certainly also passionate about tuberculosis. But I think from a policy perspective, the most, a very important investment would be in enabling integrated care, right? And so I think I'm advocating, yes, for investment still in the leading infectious disease killers, but in an integrated way, right? So we need to strengthen diagnostic systems, surveillance systems across diseases and move somewhat away from the siloed infrastructure. I think we've been fortunate in that the innovation systems that were created for TB, HIV, and malaria were applied in a way for COVID-19. That in countries, countries basically built from these strong vertical programs their COVID-19 response. But I think now it's time to turn it around and build it back in a broad and integrated way. So what we need is investment in innovation and research infrastructure that can be applied, to all kinds of diseases. And in systems, diagnostic systems, lab systems, health systems that can be, again, responding in a resilient way across diseases.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Hind, for the last word.
Thanks, Dakota. Difficult question because, we all want a bit of money and investment. I would say, like in the first message on COVID was really sanitation and hygiene. and to think about that we're living at this time when we still have billions of people without basic sanitary services. Even a simple message like wash your hands, they don't have wash facilities, hand washing facilities at home. And we know that this is an important building block to really safeguard a lot of health and a lot of other health issues. So in a way, I feel like prioritizing investments in resilient systems and resilient health systems is critical. In addition, obviously, we want to have strong surveillance. We want to me, I feel like we really need to invest to build capacities at country level, to have strong surveillance at country level, so that we have early warnings and we can have a response that stems from the country. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for your participation today. And thank you to those who are listening. It has been, I think, a really fascinating discussion to hear each of our panelists speak from their respective vantage points, both about the work that they're doing and the continuation of all of the important progress that has been made, but how we learn and as Katrina said, build back better. So thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Unite for putting together this fantastic panel.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you. All right, so this concludes the first day of the Unite Global Summit. Thank you to all of the incredible panelists and to our partners who participated today. It was truly an amazing day. Many interesting topics covered and many calls to actions made for parliamentarians and policymakers to demonstrate political leadership to address these infectious diseases. So please do not miss out on the second and final day tomorrow. We will begin again at 9 a.m. Lisbon, London time. Thank you all so much, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.